I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute and on behalf of the Murrow College of Communication, who's our co-sponsor for this event, I want to welcome you out to, this is now, I think, our 6th annual Media and Politics Symposium that we hold here at Washington State University every year. We are very fortunate to have with us a distinguished panel to talk about the role of the White House press secretary and the communications between the White House and the press. And we have like I say, an excellent panel. I'm going to introduce them actually in reverse order. The person I introduced last will speak first. The way it's going to work is I've asked each of them to take 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, we'll throw it up into Q&A. So our last speaker will be Robert Mann. And Robert Mann holds the Douglas Manship Chair of Journalism at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. He's also a political columnist for the New Orleans Times. Bob is the former director of LSU's Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs, and he was a former communications director to Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco. Prior to this, Bob worked for 17 years as the state director and press secretary for U.S. Senator John Breaux of Louisiana, and earlier as press secretary to both Senators Russell Long and Bennett Johnson, both from Louisiana. Bob is the author of more than 10 books on topics ranging from political advertising in the presidency to the modern civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. Just prior to him, our speaker will be Lawrence Pintak. Larry is the founding dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication here at WSU. Larry is a former CBS Middle East correspondent and perhaps the leading chronicler of interaction between the Arab and Western media. His books and articles focus on America's relationship with the Muslim world, the role of media in shaping global perceptions in government policy, and the future of journalism in the digital global age. He has won 2 Overseas Press Club awards and was twice nominated for international Emmys. Of special interest to our discussion today, Larry also covered the Ford and Carter White Houses, and he asked me to tell you that's when he was a very, very young AP reporter radio reporter. Our first speaker today will be Scott McClellan. Scott is currently the vice president for communications at Seattle University, and of course he is the former White House press secretary for George W. Bush, a position he served in between 2003 and 2006. Prior to that time, Scott served as the deputy White House press secretary and as traveling press secretary for the Bush-Cheney presidential campaign in 2000. Scott graduated from the University of Texas in 1991 and began his career as a political campaign manager, working in several successful statewide campaigns in Texas before becoming a senior aide to the then governor, George Bush. Scott is the author of the New York Times #1 bestseller, What Happened? Inside the Bush White House and Washington's Culture of Deception. That book addresses his experiences as Bush's White House press secretary. And just to give you a flavor of that book, I'm going to read you a short quote from it. Scott writes, "As press secretary, I spent countless hours defending the administration from the podium in the White House briefing room. Although the things I said then were sincere, I have since come to realize that some of them were badly misguided. In these pages, I've tried to come to grips with some of the truths that life inside the White House bubble obscured. History appears poised to confirm what most Americans today have already decided, that the decision to invade Iraq was a serious strategic blunder. War should only be waged when necessary, and the Iraq War was not. Waging an unnecessary war is a grave mistake, but in reflecting on all that happened during the Bush administration, I've come to believe that an even more fundamental mistake was made, a decision to turn away from candor and honesty when those qualities were most needed." So that gives you a little sense of his book. Join me now in welcoming our panelists and Scott McClellan.
Thank you, Cornell. And I just say it's great to be here to start off with. and I appreciate everything that the Foley Institute and all the staff with the Foley Institute does. Certainly when I think of Tom Foley, I think of kind of what one of my ideals is when we went to Washington in the first place, someone that was a statesman, someone that believed that politics was about finding common ground to get things done, and that's certainly the way I was raised, and certainly the spirit in which I went to work for then Governor Bush back in 1999. So it's an honor to be here. I'm with two very distinguished panelists, and certainly more distinguished than I am, I think, in many ways, but glad to share the stage and glad to share some of my experiences and insights with everybody that's here today. This is my first time in Pullman, so I guess I should start off with Go Cougs. But I think one of my former deputy White House press secretaries happened to be from Spokane and went to Washington State. And one thing I always remember about him is that he never let me live it down when, I believe it was 2002, when the Cougars beat my Texas Longhorns, where I went to school, in the Holiday Bowl. And in fact, he gave me a VHS tape of that game for my birthday. I have not watched it once. I think it's in a box somewhere when we moved to Seattle about 2.5 years ago. It's interesting. People still to this day, I've been at Seattle University now for about two and a half years, as I said, and they ask me, well, how'd you go from politics to higher ed, or from that other Washington to the great state of Washington? And I remember back in 2012, my then 3.5-year-old, my oldest son, when I told him, well, we're going to be moving to Seattle. We were still living in D.C. at the time, and he was born in Arlington, Virginia. And naturally, at that age, you're a little curious. And he said, why? And I said, well, I'm going to work at a place called Seattle University. And he said, why? and I said, well, it's a great school and a great city. And he's, why? So you kind of get the drift. And I thought, boy, this 3.5-year-old has no idea that his dad is fully used to these kind of tactics. He kind of asked the same question over and over again. Not that I'm comparing White House reporters to 3.5-year-olds, because that wouldn't be fair to 3.5-year-olds. But no, in all seriousness, I do think back to my White House days, and I used to, as White House press secretary. Does anybody remember General Russ Honore? Bob certainly will, and Larry probably will, but here was this iconic figure who came in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and when things weren't quite going the way they should have been, and he kind of took control along with Thad Allen, the Coast Guard commander who was helping it, and the Coast Guard, of course, was doing a great job despite some of the other shortcomings there. And anyway, I remember I told General Honore during that time, he'd come to the White House, we'd been down to New Orleans several times in the Gulf Coast, that I'd named a White House press briefing. There's kind of 5 categories I had for White House press briefings, and one of them's kind of the human piñata, and you can guess who the human piñata is. But the one that I named for him was back during that time in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and you'll remember that Hurricane Rita was coming shortly thereafter and approaching the Gulf Coast. And so General Honore was talking to a gaggle of reporters, probably about 5 or 6. And I remember I was watching it live in my office, in the press office in the West Wing, and he was on TV, and this one reporter kept asking him over and over again about Katrina, and General Honore was trying to say, this is what you need to do to get ready for Hurricane Rita, and I'm trying to tell people how to get ready for Hurricane Rita. Well, the reporter persisted, asking him the same question over and over again. Finally, General Honore looked at him, and I can't do his Cajun accent or his Mississippi accent, and looked at the reporter and said, you are stuck on stupid. I'm not answering your question, and completely shut the reporter down. and I thought, okay, there's the 5th category of briefings, the stuck on stupid briefing, because there's certainly the substantive briefings and all those others. But I told him often, anytime you saw me smiling when I was sitting there listening to a question from a White House reporter, I was probably thinking to myself, boy, what a stupid question, but I just couldn't say it. And he finally did it for me. At any rate, the White House Press Corps, and there are a lot of good people in the White House Press Corps in all seriousness, just like there are a lot of good people in politics. And, when I certainly have great admiration and respect for President Bush. He was someone, when I first went to work for him in the governor's office back in 1999, I was attracted to him because he was someone who was known as a uniter, what he ran on back in 1999 and 2000 during the first campaign, someone who reached across the aisle as governor and got things done. And that's having been born into politics, so to speak. I had a mother that was mayor of Austin when I was in third grade through high school. We were raised on the importance of politics being about trying to find common ground, trying to compromise, and doing what's best for the common good. Things didn't quite turn out the way that we had hoped, but I will say that certainly, as we all know, that the Bush presidency was a very consequential presidency. And in fact, you have the image up there now on the screen. 8 months into his presidency, of course, is a day that none of us will ever forget. And that is a moment that is one that I remember very vividly. I was with the president that morning on 9/11. This is at Booker T. Washington Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. At the time, I was the principal deputy White House press secretary, and typically when we traveled, you'd have the White House press secretary, my predecessor there sitting down, R.A. Flesher, traveling with the president aboard Air Force One, and you have about 10 or 15 reporters traveling the press pool aboard Air Force One, and then you'd have a charter with the larger White House press corps, and Deputy Press Secretary would travel aboard that, and anywhere we went, we had a large room set up so the press could file their stories. The TVs would be set up in that room. And you also had a broadcast area where the reporters could go and prepare their stories for the broadcast news or for radio as well. Well, that morning, we had overnighted in Sarasota, Florida. The president had been talking about his education reforms. And so, as I would do on trips like this when I was serving as the deputy, I got on the press buses and we headed to Sarasota, headed to the elementary school that morning ahead of the president. And as we got there, the press started setting up in the filing center that was set up in the school. I went into the library for a little bit and sat down, I think in the back room. It was a pretty small room, an elementary school library. And I was sitting between two White House reporters, one from USA Today, Judy Keene, and the other, David Sanger from the New York Times, two that I knew very well at that point. Judy had covered us during the campaign, and I'd gotten to know David since we'd been in the White House. And at that stage, we still had the pagers, but one of the staff people in the White House press office, who was a critical staff person who probably made the least of anybody and worked the longest hours, was a guy that tracked our breaking news and did a lot of different research projects. But one of his primary responsibilities, in addition to getting out the morning news to everybody at the senior White House staff and as well as the press staff, was to make sure that if there was breaking news right before a briefing or something, that he was informing the press secretary and keeping him up to date on things. Well, literally at the moment the first tower had been hit, I believe it was 8:47 a.m. that morning, he had it paged to us. CNN was reporting that the World Trade Center has been hit by an airplane. And I looked at my pager and I said, huh. And the two reporters sitting next to me are like, what? And I said, it says that CNN's saying that one of the World Trade Center towers has been hit. And we all thought, huh. I think everybody at that moment was kind of thinking it was some small plane had gone off course and hit the World Trade Center. So the three of us got up at the same time and we went over to the press filing center, which was close by. And so I'm standing at the back of the filing center. All the reporters are at their stations, at the tables that have been set up, looking at CNN, which was playing on the TV at the moment. And I'm visiting with a couple of people in the back of the room. And all of a sudden, you see a second explosion on CNN. And I don't think I saw it the first time. I was one of those. And some people said, well, that was a secondary explosion. Others said, no, that was a second plane. And then they showed the replay pretty soon thereafter. Sure enough, it was a second plane. And at that very moment, every White House reporter in that filing center turned around and looked at me as if I knew anything at that moment. But at the same time, just as that was happening, one of our advanced guys who travels ahead of the presidents, works with the Secret Service and helps make sure things are set up and staged for however we want it staged for the media purposes and so forth, came walking into the room and he said, you need to get to the president's hold. So anywhere we go, there's always a presidential hold. There's usually a senior staff hold too. They were one and the same that day, where you have secure phones set up and just a place where the president can relax if he needs to, or if he needs to talk on classified matters, he can get on that secure phone as well. And I said yes, and so I followed him out of the room. We went around the school, and just as we were going, the only way we could get to the presidential hold was to go through the classroom where the president was reading with the second graders at that point. And the press pool had been in there just doing some filming of the president at the moment, and they were walking out of the room, and they were just starting to hear. We heard that the second tower got hit too, and I said, well, yeah, confirmed that's what we saw on TV as well. I said, I don't know anything else at this point. But as we walked into the room, the president was still sitting there. He had just been informed, I would later find out, by the White House chief of staff, who went in and wanted to be very succinct and not look disruptive or anything, and bent down and whispered in his ear, Mr. President, the second tower has been hit by a second plane. America is under attack. And so I'm coming in, walking through the back of the room, and he's probably about the distance between me and this third row here. And I'd never seen that look on his face before at that moment, but obviously looking back, he knew we were at war at that point. I think either the teacher or one of the kids was reading, but he was kind of looking straight ahead and in a very focused glaze. And so we walk into the presidential hold here. You see there's one of the secure phones set up, and one of the Situation Room, the director of the Situation Room was traveling with us that day, Captain Lauer. And this is when we're talking about what the president is going to say. The president had also called, I believe it was the FBI director, Director Mueller, who had been on the job all of about a week or a little over a week, talked to Governor Pintak of New York to say that we'd be mobilizing all resources necessary to help. And I believe it was Condi Rice as well that he had spoken to. And so we're talking about, that he's going to have to go out and address the media or address the nation for the first time at the school and cancel the event, and talking about what he's going to say. And then we walk out to give his first remarks after the attacks. And I remember my predecessor, Ari, there looked at me and said, should you come with us on Air Force One? And it was just a spur of the moment type reaction. I said, I don't think so. I think I need to stay here with the press corps because I'm their only link to Washington. And then the president went out there and gave his remarks. They left on Air Force One, which at the moment the Secret Service thought maybe was a potential target. Of course, we didn't know everything that was happening at that point. I went back to the filing center and then walked outside into the schoolyard, and all the broadcast reporters were getting ready to go live on the air. So I gave them a little color of who the president had spoken to and what he had said to them. And then as I'm heading back to the filing center from outside there, a Fox News producer came running up to me who had covered us during the campaign and said, Scott, we hear that the executive office building has been hit. And that's probably the first time it really jolted me at the moment, because I'd just been in the moment trying to do my job till then. The old executive office building, the Eisenhower executive office building, is part of the White House complex. It's where most of the White House staff works, and a lot of friends, and including my brother, worked in the executive office building. And so we went, and I was trying to get connection back to D.C., and we were having trouble even connecting back with one of my counterparts who was in the Situation Room at the time. But we're watching CNN, and then she confirmed, this producer confirmed, that what had happened was that the Fox News camera had been filming in the direction of the Pentagon, and in between it was the executive office building, and the smoke was coming up, and it was the Pentagon that had been hit at that moment. I remember that was the first time, of course, horrible moment, and the third attack that morning. And I remember at that moment taking a brief moment to call my mother's office in Austin, and told her assistant, just said, tell her I'm fine, I'm in Sarasota, Florida, I'll call her tonight. And at any rate, the president had left by that point. And I remember the White House reporters gave me a lot of kudos, saying, thank you for staying here. Without you, we wouldn't have done anything. I tried to remind them of that years later. Hey, remember I stayed there with you, but it never seemed to work. At any rate, the rest of that day, all the coverage started shifting elsewhere. But we still have, 40 or 50 White House reporters, and we can't fly them back because all the planes have been grounded. United Airlines was a charter, and there was no way they were going to fly. And so we're trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to get them back to D.C. and how are we going to get ourselves back to D.C. At that point. So we overnighted there, heard the president speak from the Oval Office later that night, was certainly staying in touch with staff back at the White House. The next morning, I walk into the filing center at the resort we had been staying at, which was supposed to close down the day before, and there's a filing center set up there. And as I walk into the room early in the morning, one, and I'll leave the person unnamed, but one White House News reporter came walking up to me in front of the whole group and said, Scott, you're a deputy assistant to the president, deputy White House press secretary. You got to get us back to D.C. You can get us a military plane. And I was taken aback at the moment. I looked at him and I said, his name, and I said, I think there are more important things than you right now. And it was interesting that about a half hour later, I was in the press staff office. There was a staff assistant that traveled with us as well. And the gentleman's producer came over to me and said, you did the right thing standing him down that morning. And anyway, we ended up getting buses for the press. I jumped in I think it was a Suburban with a couple of advanced people and our press staff person that was with me. I said, he's coming with us. And then we got the Secret Service agent who worked with the press as well and said, oh, let's get him. And we just floored it back to D.C., got back in about 14 hours. But that moment, of course, shaped the presidency like none other. And in the weeks after that, I mean, we were certainly going 24/7. You'll remember the anthrax attacks and that happened after that as well. And that was something I was focused on, working with the Department of Health and Human Services and some of my counterparts over there as well. But you can't underestimate how all that shaped the Bush presidency and some of the consequential decisions he made after that. And certainly it was alluded to in my introduction by Cornell when he talked about the Iraq War. And, perhaps the most consequential decision of the Bush presidency. Now, I was still deputy press secretary when we were going to war in Iraq at that point. Most of my time was spent focused on domestic issues during that time, although I did fill in for my predecessor when he was gone. In fact, to back up real quick, I've got a few pictures here. I won't go into all the stories because we don't have time, and I want to get to questions. But here, this is actually the first game in New York of the World Series after September 11th on October 30th, 2001. We had choppered in. My predecessor is a Yankee. He was sick that day. We had all been working so hard. He must have really been sick because he said, I need you to go for me. And so we choppered in Marine One and then landed there. And just real quickly, there I am, of course, giving Bush advice, you might think. There's someone with a little more experience coming in who gives some advice right after me. That was the moment when the president asked Derek Jeter, he said, who came down there to warm up. This was underneath the old Yankee Stadium. He said, so should I stand on the mound or in front of the mound? And Jeter looked at him and said, oh, Mr. President, if you don't stand on the mound, you're in New York. They're going to let you know it. So he stood on the mound, and he threw a strike, I might add. But at any rate, there's just some shots inside Marine One. So this is the White House Press Secretary's office. That press gaggle, December 14th, 2003, Sunday. That was when I was woken up in the middle of the night by my wife because I sleep heavy, and she had gotten a call from the Situation Room. She always talked about how friendly they were, and they're very professional people, military personnel. And she woke me up, and I was informed that we had captured Saddam Hussein that day. And so that's early the next morning when I'm gaggling with the White House press corps and kind of running through how the president found out and what he said and so forth. And then the other briefing there is just the old briefing room. We started the remodel when I was there. We didn't finish it, but that was my very first day as White House press secretary. So when I'm coming in as press secretary, we're already several weeks into the war in Iraq. I remember kind of looking at my predecessor before he left when he told me he was leaving, and then shortly before I took over as press secretary, I said, well, you picked a really good time to leave. Now all the press is focusing on, there's no WMD. There's the beginnings of our first big scandal was really starting to happen at that point, though we didn't really know it at that point, the Valerie Plame leak episode. And the White House press corps had been not the White House press. I'd say the White House press corps and the national media had been under a lot of criticisms because people were saying, well, you weren't tough enough on the Bush White House in the lead up to the war and pressing them on the intelligence and the case for war. And I remember when shortly after the president had offered me the position as well, Karen Hughes, who was someone who had reached out to me to hire me in the governor's office in the first place, and certainly one of his closest confidants going back to his early days as governor, came into my office and said, well, I was very much behind this decision. And she looked at me and said, what you have, which is very important right now, is great relations with the press. You have you're trusted. They trust you, and you're a trusting person. And the most important thing for you to do is to be able to protect his trust and credibility, his honesty and trustworthiness, which is something that is looked at in the polls very closely during a presidency. And so that was kind of the backdrop and the context of when I was coming in as White House press secretary. And certainly trust is one of the most important things when you're trying to, part of the real role of a White House press secretary is to be an advocate for the president, for his agenda, for his policies, and for his decisions, and to defend those policies and those decisions, and to defend the president. But part of that is also helping to shape the narrative in a way that helps advance his agenda and also helps give the president an advantage in a lot of other ways as well. So as I'm coming in there, one of the things that Cornell thought that I ought to talk about is what was my greatest challenge. Well, that's the greatest challenge right there. We're coming into this situation. His trust is starting to take a hit. That was one of his strengths, that he had that people trusted him. They viewed him as authentic and someone that was genuine and that they could trust. And then we go through the Iraq War. And the Iraq War, as was alluded to in the introduction as well, certainly as I left the White House and then reflected back on my time there, like a lot of people, I gave the president and the team, the senior team, national security team, the benefit of the doubt. It was a very seasoned team, a team that had done very well in the early days of the war in Afghanistan and post 9/11, that this was a necessary war. Certainly as I went through writing my book, I came to the conclusion that it wasn't a necessary war. But even more important than that, as you look back at the Bush presidency, was there was certainly faulty intelligence, but there was also a narrative that was developed in the building the case for war that was overstated, that was what I would refer to as a faulty narrative. I don't believe it was people conspiring to intentionally mislead or anything like that. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I certainly don't think people like Colin Powell were sitting in the room saying, well, let's go and do this. But the case that was stated was that Iraq was a grave and gathering danger, and then the intelligence was packaged in a way to make that case. And intelligence of greater certainty was packaged with intelligence of lesser certainty. And so that faulty narrative was something that was very challenging for us and very challenging for me to try to protect his sense of trust and that he had with the American people. And then as Bob can appreciate as well, as his trust dropped and as things continued to or didn't come to an end in Iraq, the situation continued to deteriorate or become tougher in terms of the battle on the ground in Iraq. When people thought it was going to be a much shorter war, certainly the expectations were that way. His poll numbers started to drop. The honesty and trustworthiness that he had developed started to drop significantly. And then in 2005, that summer was when it was found out that some of the information I had said to the press corps, and I won't go into great detail here because it's a much longer story, around the Valerie Plame leak episode, when I said that both Karl Rove and Scooter Libby, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, had assured me that they were not involved in any way in leaking Valerie Plame's name to the press, a CIA covert agent at the time. It started to become known, no, Karl had been talking to the press about it, and then weeks later it became, Scooter had been talking about it too. They maybe weren't the ones that were responsible for the initial leak, but they certainly were involved. And I did use that language very carefully. They assured me they were not involved in this to provide me some sort of protection at the time. But at the same time, they were under investigation. There's a grand jury going on, and the special prosecutor asked us not to talk about it. So that began a period of, toward the end of my White House time as White House press secretary. It was 2 years in when that first revelation became known. A very difficult period for me, but one of the things that kind of helped me get through it was certainly the trust I had built with White House reporters, and certainly even though we couldn't talk about it, White House reporters are even saying, well, I was in a tough position and defending me by saying his reputation is sterling and things, and that he's a straight shooter. And so I appreciated that. But looking back on it, it was certainly the beginning of a period of disillusionment for me, and a period of, at some point, I've got to decide when I'm going to be leaving the White House. The average tenure of a West Wing staffer is about 2.5 years. By that point, I had been there over 4 as the deputy and then as White House press secretary. At any rate, so that's the backdrop in terms of what I viewed as the greatest challenge, was trying to restore that. And then we come into August, weeks later, and Hurricane Katrina hits. And there's a larger story there as well, but what had happened before Katrina, as the war continued to drag on there and the situation continued to deteriorate, people had lost trust in the presidency. Katrina came along, and there were certainly breakdowns at all levels, but the federal government is kind of viewed as that fail-safe backstop, if you will. People started to question the competency of the administration. And so that was a second big hit for the presidency. He could never recover fully from what had happened with the Iraq War. And then it was tough to recover after that, because then we had the bombing of the Golden Mosque in Iraq, which was another defining moment during the Iraq War as well. Before, this was about a year or so before the surge at that point. So when I think back on it, I think back to that as being the biggest challenge, and certainly when I look at what changes might be done from my time as White House press secretary in terms of the briefing and things like that. There are a few. I mean, one of them was alluded to again in the introduction too. But the first one thing that I think that ought to change is I think the White House press briefing is kind of antiquated, if you will, where the press secretary goes in there and speaks from the podium on a daily basis. I think of things like a briefing that NASA would give. We went through the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster during that time as well, where they're set up at a table. They have all the experts in there. They have one person leading that, and that a White House briefing would be better served in that kind of format where you're bringing in cabinet secretaries and others. And certainly during my time as press secretary, I tried to do more of that, where I brought members of the cabinet or others into the briefing room. There are two reasons for that. One, because I felt it was important to be able to get our story across, and the White House press corps, of course, wanted that kind of access. The second was I wanted them to appreciate what I went through on a daily basis. I think everyone that walked in that briefing room, cabinet secretaries go, I don't know how you do that on a daily basis. It's a very small room with 48 seats, and it's very cramped, and certainly on a big news day, you have people, it's standing room only in that room. And in July, I can tell you, in July and August in D.C., people are coming in and out of the door, which leads right to the north lawn of the White House. You have to crank that AC down to about as low as it can go just to try to keep any sense of cool air coming into that room, because you have all the Klieg lights focused on you. You have 3 or 4 camera guys standing right behind you at the podium, filming over your shoulder. And I remember the president one time when he never really liked to be in the briefing room. He preferred either the Rose Garden or the East Room for press briefings or press conferences. And he did some sort of statement in there, took a few questions. And I think it was a hot day, and he goes, I don't know how you do it in there. It's so hot in that room. So part of that was to get people to appreciate what I go through, so they'd be more helpful to me when I was coming to them as well. But so the background briefings is one thing, but the other thing that is kind of goes with that is critical to a presidency is, and I think changing Washington. One of the big themes of the book was the need to move beyond this excessive partisanship and move beyond this culture of deception and this divisiveness that is keeping us from getting things done on some of the bigger issues. And everything's focused on the next election. The press corps is focused on who's winning and who's losing, instead of focusing on, well, what's the truth behind things. Is that you need to have a White House and a president that are fully committed to a high level of candor in how they approach things if they really want to change Washington. That's not an easy thing to do, as I say that, but that's certainly one of the most important things to do, and certainly something that statesmen like Tom Foley and statesmen like from his generation certainly understood the importance of embracing that candor and working across the aisle and being open and forthright with one another. So as I look back on the Bush presidency, what for me, the two words that I always come back to is I kind of view it as a missed opportunity. We came in with these high hopes that he would be a uniter, not a divider, and that we could change things. And for a variety of reasons, things didn't turn out the way that we had hoped. But I look back on that and the decision to go to the war in Iraq, the decision of how to sell that war to Iraq, and I think about all the good things that President Bush did, that it overshadows. You think back to things like what he did in terms of his Africa initiatives. It was unprecedented what he has done in Africa in terms of his initiative for HIV/AIDS, and in terms of his malaria initiative, $1 billion malaria initiative. Both of those have saved millions of lives, and yet they get overshadowed by some of these more consequential decisions. I wouldn't say more consequential decisions, but certainly ones that got more attention than those decisions. And I think back about his stance on immigration reform and what we may have been able to accomplish had it not been for the situation in the aftermath of the Iraq War, and how the partisanship crept back into D.C. that we had in the aftermath of 9/11, when there was this great sense of unity, and certainly that moment back at the World Series when the whole country was united. So those are my kind of opening thoughts and comments. I think I'll stop there and let others talk, and so we can get to the Q&A. But I very much appreciate being here. Thank you for having me. I'll do a couple of quick images too, just in case you're interested to see what it's like on the inside. There's inside the Oval Office. The bottom left, we're getting ready to walk out to Marine One and take a trip. The bottom right, it looks like he's maybe chewing me out, but actually that's a bunch of Wall Street Journal reporters coming in to do a sit-down interview with the president in the Oval Office. And there had been I don't remember what the issue was, but there had been some big issue happening that day that I'd been asked about in the press briefing. And he was asking me, what did you say again? And so we were on the same page. There's walking down the colonnade outside the press briefing room and around from the Oval Office as he's heading to the residency. And we're just visiting. A look inside Air Force One. There's a press gaggle on Air Force One with the press pool. And again, Air Force One. A little fun in Crawford, Texas. How many people can say that they had the president drive them around at their ranch? So that's one of my favorite keepsake pictures there. Visiting with Colin Powell. I think we were having a world leader meeting during that time. And just a few other shots from Crawford. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll echo what Scott said and
thank Washington State for the invitation to be here on your beautiful campus. What a really gorgeous campus this is. I work on a campus that I think is really quite something, but this place has kind of taken my breath away, and you're very fortunate to be here, and it's delightful to be here with this distinguished panel and Cornell and the other wonderful people at the Foley Institute. And I, like Scott, have had a tremendous amount of respect for Tom Foley and echo what you had to say about what he represented in bipartisanship and those long since those days that are long gone of people working together in a bipartisan manner in Washington. Maybe we can get those back someday. I'll talk a little bit. You know, I don't have the experience in the pressure cooker that Scott had, and so I'm going to give you maybe a little bit different perspective on dealing with the press. The closest thing that I have to that kind of experience is something that Scott and I have in common. We're both, first of all, we're both from Texas. I'm from Beaumont. He's from Austin. But I was working as communications director for Governor Blanco of Louisiana during Katrina, and he was in the White House at the same time. And the most difficult time that I ever had with the news media, there were probably many of the people that you work with on a daily basis who had left Washington and come down to keep their eyes on us, was working with the media during the 6 to 8 weeks when it was most intense after Katrina in late August of 2005. So for a couple of months, I had a little bit of insight into what you must have gone through every day, and so I have nothing but admiration for the fact that you did it for as long as you did it and did it as well as you did it. And I'd also like to say, before I get into the meat of my remarks, how much I admire, Scott, what you wrote in your book, and the fact that you wrote that book when you wrote that book. I did a book a few years ago, A History of American Wartime Dissent. I have a tremendous amount of admiration, and I've spent a long time studying people from the Revolutionary War on through the Gulf War who stood up and dissented and said, this is wrong, what we're doing. You were sort of a dissenter at the end of, sort of in the during and the end of the war, but I have a tremendous amount of admiration for people who stand up and say, I dissent, because dissenting against war is perhaps the most difficult dissent in our society. And so I have a particular amount of admiration for people who stand up and say and speak the truth in those times. When I moved to Washington in January of 1985, and as press secretary to Senator Russell Long, who had been in the Senate. He was the second most senior member of the Senate at the time. He had been there 36 years in the Senate when I came to work for him. And I look back and I think, what in the world was he thinking, hiring me to come be his press secretary? I was 26 years old. I didn't know a thing about. I'd been to Washington, I think, twice in my life. I didn't know anything about anything, and he gave me a job as his press secretary, and I know the reason he did. I had spent the previous 6 years as a newspaper reporter. I had studied journalism in school, and worked as a reporter, And so what I didn't know about the ways of Washington and what I didn't know about press relations, I made up for a little bit, I think, in the beginning, that I knew what a journalist thought like. I knew what a journalist wanted. I knew what journalists believed. I knew the norms of the profession. I knew what it took to be a journalist and what they expected of people who had information that they needed. And so while I was figuring out the job, I at least had that going for me. And if you're a press secretary for a member of Congress or a governor or a mayor or any politician, any public official, sort of below the rank of cabinet secretary in the federal government, you have a bit of an advantage over someone like Scott, I think. The relationship between press and press secretary and press and public official is always adversarial. It just always is, and it should be. That's the way that our system is set up, and we shouldn't bemoan the fact that reporters are asking tough questions, sometimes asking aggressive questions, sometimes pissing us off and being impertinent. That's what they're paid to do. It's the only profession. It's the only occupation that's mentioned in the Constitution, and so I think we should respect that and honor that. But the advantage that I had over Scott, I think, was situational, and it had nothing to do with me. It just had to do with the fact that I could count on both fingers the number of reporters that I had to deal with on an average day, and usually I could count on both hands. Usually I could count on one hand the number of people that I had to deal with in one day. It was the Washington correspondent for the Baton Rouge Advocate, the Washington correspondent for the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Gannett reporter, and maybe an AP reporter and a person who was a sort of a stringer for a group of independent newspapers or something like that. And so I could develop a personal relationship with these people. I could take them out to, we could go to lunch together, we could spend time together, I could become friends with them in ways that I know you just could not do. You can't. I'm sure you had relationships with reporters, but you couldn't have relationships with them all. You couldn't get into their minds in the way that a press secretary for a member of Congress could, because you couldn't develop those kind of relationships. And when I would travel with Senator Long and Senator Breaux, particularly around Louisiana, these were people that I had worked with. I was dealing with journalists who were a few years ago my colleagues. We had covered campaigns together. They were my friends. They saw me as now a guy who'd gone to the dark side, a guy who had gone over into politics, and it certainly was adversarial. But we were still friends. We still knew each other. There were people whose I'd been in their weddings, and I was godfather to some of their children. That kind of thing. We still had relationships, and I was able to use that in ways that I don't think you can at a higher level, because you just have so many people to deal with, and the stakes are just so much higher. When I said something that was, and I did it often, when I misspoke on behalf of Senator Breaux or Senator Long or Governor Blanco, the consequences weren't that great. I could clean it up pretty quickly. When you misspoke, and I'm not saying you misspoke, but if you misspoke, the consequences, the stakes were like, you were doing high wire stuff every single day without a net, and I was walking a chalk line, and if I stumbled, it was completely different. It was completely different. And so I was working in a completely different world, and I had that advantage, and I used it. And I'm not saying that I used it particularly well. There were a lot of people who do this line of work, who did it a lot better than I did it. And I certainly have spent a lot of time beating myself up over the mistakes that I made after Katrina in handling the press. And I've spent a lot of time over the years talking with Governor Blanco about that, the mistakes we all made in dealing with the media, and what I wish I had done differently. But what I did do is, I teach journalism now. I teach political communication. I teach young people how to be press secretaries and how to be speechwriters and how how to work in the field that Scott and I spent a lot of our lives, professional lives, working in. I teach that now at a journalism school, but I also teach journalism, and I also am still doing journalism. And a couple of years ago, I have a blog, a political blog that I write in addition to my column in the New Orleans paper. And I sat down, and it was after an event at the White House when it was actually during the 2012 election when Ann Romney was complaining about the way the press was treating Mitt Romney. And then a few weeks later, there was maybe even a few days later, there was a very contentious episode between President Obama, the White House press corps, and President Obama's press people, and it got me to thinking about what reporters don't know about press secretaries or their spokespeople or flacks, as some people call them, and what we on the side of the spokesperson, the press secretary, don't understand, or the politician don't understand about the press. We think we know what the reporter's doing. We think we know what the reporter is thinking, but we don't. And the reporter thinks that she knows what we're doing behind the scenes and why we're doing what we're doing, but they really don't. I mean, there's so many assumptions made. And so I sat down on my blog and I wrote out what I call 15 rules for press secretaries in dealing with the press. And I was kind of amused that a few weeks later I got an email from a guy who works for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services who liked what I wrote and has now adopted it into this training manual that they use for their state agency directors. For whatever that's worth. But anyway, I want to if I may, they're not long. They're just 15 rules that I think are worth considering, and that if you're dealing, I think this can help you if you're dealing with the press as a press secretary, as a spokesperson for a politician, or if you're ever just in a situation where you're dealing with a reporter. A lot of average people come in contact with reporters. Something happens and they have to do an interview or have to have interaction, and they don't know what they make assumptions and they make mistakes. They don't know what the rules are, and I think it's important to know that. So here, I just want to share really quickly what I wrote, and I started it off by saying that these are some of the lessons that I learned in my 20+ years on the political side of the fence. And I said maybe I'll one day chime in with some advice for reporters, which a friend of mine did, who was a former White House correspondent for the Associated Press, and I put that on my blog too, and I'll be happy to share that with you if you'd like. But I said that these are lessons I learned mostly from violating them. So I'm not speaking from a sense of superiority. I learned these lessons because I committed most of these sins. Number one, whining about your press coverage does not improve your press coverage. Number two, if you're not getting good press coverage, the fault is almost always yours, not the news media's. Telling a reporter that her story is not worth covering is a very good way to ensure extensive coverage of that issue. Shouting at reporters and intimidating reporters might work in the short term, but in the long term, effects of that on your news coverage and your soul are corrosive and counterproductive. Raising your voice at a reporter about a story is often very helpful in getting the dreaded story on the front page. What they teach you in college public relation courses really is true. You'll get better press coverage if you work on building relationships with reporters, not figuring out brilliant ways to manipulate them. Working well with reporters doesn't mean buying them meals or drinks. It means understanding the demands of their job and doing your best to help them do those jobs. Respect reporters and their deadlines. These are people with families with whom they'd like to spend time with after writing that story about you. If you help them with the information they need in a timely fashion, you'll have a better shot at being treated fairly and accurately in their stories. I always ask my students, what do reporters want most? And they'll say, oh, to be on the front page. They'll say, they want to win the Pulitzer Prize. So what do reporters want most? Reporters want to go home. They want to write their damn story and go home. And if you're making them wait till 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock to get the quote of the information they need, you've ruined their day. They don't get to tuck their kids in at bed at night. They don't get to have dinner with their families. They want to go home. Reporters are very perceptive. If you hate them and regard them as the enemy, they pick up on that very quickly. While they try to be fair in their coverage of you, it's difficult to be objective about someone who hates you. Lying to a reporter is the worst sin in press relations, and you will usually get caught, sometimes immediately. A skilled, aggressive reporter assigned to cover your department or your elected official is often a blessing. He will sometimes learn about problems in your organization long before you do. A good relationship with that reporter doesn't mean that mischief or improprieties don't get covered, but it could make the vital difference in who gets blamed and how you are portrayed in his story. Sometimes it might even mean learning about the problem in time to correct it or address it. And this, at the risk of offending you, Scott, I've never been offended before. I've had several Republican friends of mine tell me that I'm right on this, but I'm open to being challenged about this point. If you're a Republican, you are most likely hardwired to treat the mainstream press with disdain and deep suspicion. The creativity of your press releases or the effectiveness of your media events pale in comparison to whether and how well you try to overcome a bias that will poison your relationships with the news media. That said, it is possible to become too friendly with a reporter. You will usually regret this. One or both of you may be compromised in some way, or you will make the mistake of believing you have immunity from that reporter and her scrutiny. You probably do not. Not every reporter is fair and ethical. Many are not, but trust and cooperation is a two-way street. The press-secretary relationship is really no different than any other. Treat someone like the enemy before you know her, and you've most likely created an enemy. And finally, you may think your job is to protect your boss and his or her reputation and advance his or her political agenda. It's not. You are, in essence, an officer of the court. You have a client, but your first duty is to the integrity of the system. Remember that when a reporter plops an unpleasant public records request on your desk, she's not asking for your records. She's asking for her records. I think that I look at the relations. I'm going to turn maybe a bit partisan here because we have a governor in Louisiana who has terrible press relations with the Louisiana media. I don't know what his relations are with the national media. He does spend more time courting them than he does the Louisiana media, and that may have something to do with his terrible press relations. But I also have had a suspicion for a long time, and this may be an area that if there's some faculty members in here that you may want to do some research on. I've thought about doing some research on it, and that is that I started looking at everyone who had ever worked for him in his press office from the day he became governor a little over 7 years ago, and he has never had a single person working in his office who spent a day as a journalist. I mean, there was no one working for him who has ever been a journalist. They all came out of campaigns, and they all came out of, I think, the mindset that the relationship between the journalist and the reporter is not only adversarial, it's combat. That this is the enemy. We have to manipulate them. We have to subjugate them. We have to keep them from finding out what we're doing. And I think that if he had hired a couple of people who had, spent even a year or two working as a journalist, even for a weekly paper, in a small time, in a small city or something, he would have been better served because I think that he sends out a message that he has disdain for the press, that he sees them as an annoyance, and that they are not a legitimate part of the process. They are not only a legitimate part of the process, they are an integral part of the process. Our democracy doesn't work without them, and to treat them like they don't belong, or to treat them like they are an institution to be manipulated or worked around, only makes it more difficult for you to do your job and to communicate with the people you're trying to represent. So I'll end there, and thank you very much. Look forward to your questions and comments later.
It's relatively late, and we have two fascinating guests, so I'm not going to take much time. I'm here all the time. You can always talk to me. But I do want to put a little context. The relationship between journalists and the White House in particular has been a cyclical one, and it has changed dramatically over the years. It has changed dramatically over our lifetime, certainly. Cornell mentioned that I covered the White House in the mid-'70s. That's how old I am. And I was 12 at the time. But I'll give you an example. The day that Jimmy Carter was inaugurated, we came down from Capitol Hill, the inauguration, and we were in the White House. We were down in the press room. And I found out from somebody that the president, the new president, was going to go from the West Wing, the office, the Oval Office, et cetera, over to the family side of the building. And there's a certain area where he has to cross. And in those days, I just got up and took my tape recorder. I was doing AP radio, took my tape recorder, wandered out, and stood there waiting for him to come by. And, hey, Mr. President, and got the first little interaction with him after he was president. Well, there's no way, as Scott will tell you, there's no way a reporter could do that today. And it's emblematic of that change in relationship. Reporters, way back when in the Truman White House, they'd play poker, famously play poker with the president. Reporters were very protective of Kennedy, winked and nodded and hid things that were going on at the White House. Watergate changed things dramatically, and I'm journalistically a child of Watergate. I went to college. We all, right in the aftermath, we all wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein and bring down a president. And so the years after, there was an adversarial relationship, but there wasn't a bitter divide, and there wasn't immediate suspicion and bordering on hatred at times, I would say, and open war. And we moved into certainly your administration, and now in some ways it's even worse. The relationship between the press and the White House is bitter. The degree of control that this White House, I'm not being political, but in factual terms, the degree of control in terms of the number of briefings and the information flow to the media has never been more controlled. But I want to throw out the first question to Scott and then throw it to you guys. You made reference to this culture of deception. New book out, Judith Miller, the New York Times correspondent, who many would say drove the whole search for weapons of mass destruction, and many would say was a pawn, as were other journalists, I would argue, a pawn of the White House, of the Bush White House. She has a new book out that's kind of an apologia, all the excuses to why she wasn't used, et cetera. There is a famous incident that Scott certainly knows well, where Judy Miller and a couple of other reporters had a front page piece in the New York Times on weapons of mass destruction on a Sunday morning. And then the then chief of staff went on Face the Nation and the other morning shows and pointed to that story as evidence that there was, the New York Times is reporting there's weapons of mass destruction when he had planted the story effectively. My question to you, Scott, is did you guys break Bob's rule about brilliant ways to manipulate the media instead of communicating with the media?
I think there were certainly certain people that engaged in that kind of behavior. And some of the ones you're referring to, I think, were working some of the reporters on background, not on the record, and planning the stories for their particular purpose. As I kind of said in my opening remarks, I don't think that there was a whole group sitting around there conspiring how are we going to go and manipulate the media or things like that. But there were certainly some that were losing sight of that rule. And by the way, I was sitting there counting how many of those rules I'd broken too. So, but very well stated on all those. And certainly ones that, when you go back to, I alluded to it, not only the case for war, but the decision to go to war. Well, part of the reason that the narrative was overstated and faulty, I'd say from the beginning, is because the real primary reason, I can speak for the president, I can't speak so much for the vice president and a few other of the neoconservatives, if you will, Paul Wolfowitz and people like that were determined to go in and topple Saddam Hussein and change the world by changing the Middle East. Well, that was certainly a big reason why the president wanted to go into the Middle East, was to spread freedom and democracy, and thinking that you could change the Middle East by the use of force. And we're seeing how difficult that is. You never know how war is going to play out, as we all know. And certainly one of the things I wanted to do in my book was help people learn from that experience so that we don't go back down that path again. But yes, there were certainly certain people, and I think some of those people were in the vice president's office that were trying to really push that angle in some of those stories. And then it gave others the chance to go and reference some of those stories. So,
can I ask one more question, then we'll throw it to them? Your relationship, those people, okay, that group that's manipulating the media on background, behind the scenes, you're the front, you're the face. What was your relationship to them, and how did that affect your life?
Well, yeah, and although, and I was the deputy at that point in the lead up, so was only minimally involved in the, except for filling in for my predecessor from time to time.
Or were you one of the guys in the background?
No, actually I wasn't. But I will say, anytime I did go on background, you always assume you're on the record. Unless you could really trust that reporter to hold to that, and you assume that it would not be anything you want to be on the record, at least from a press secretary's position. It's a little different maybe than some other senior administration official who's not someone working with the press and certainly has an agenda that they're trying to point to. Look, that's the whole culture of deception in Washington. You boil it down to and oversimplify it a little bit, but everybody's trying to manipulate that narrative to their advantage for the next election or for whatever they're trying to get passed. And part of what I discussed in the book was that how that translated into a decision, as there is no more consequential decision than a decision to go to war. And so it's different from maybe going and selling the Medicare prescription drug benefit, but the same tactics were used to do that. And and I talked about how the media became a bit complicit in this by focusing on whether or not the case was being sold to the American people, whether we were winning the case or losing the case, instead of focusing on. Now, some reporters did do that deeper dive and focusing on the case for war itself and whether or not what was being said reflected what was actually the truth on the ground in Iraq. So,
but many of their stories were buried too.
That's true. No, that's true. They were not lead stories. They were in publications that maybe didn't get as much attention as NBC News or ABC News or whoever was doing it. And certainly some of the reporters after, you look in the lead up to a war and a lead up like Iraq in the aftermath of 9/11, there is this certain sense of, I don't know if patriotism is the right word, but that people are a little bit hesitant, and networks and the broadcast leadership at networks are hesitant to maybe press as hard as they should have. And I think to some extent they certainly lost sight of their most important journalistic responsibility, which is the search for the truth and to report the truth.
When you started having those questions in your mind about the veracity of things that you were being told by the vice president's office, how did you try to compensate for that? Because I know when I've talked to like Richard Armitage or Larry Wilkerson, a lot of people, particularly about the plane incident, but some of the other things, they were all very sympathetic to you and basically feeling, well, he was just being fed a lot of this. And I know that you were, and you talk about it in your book, that you started questioning it, but did you start trying to double check with other sources? Because, you were trying to have that trust relationship with people within the administration, and you started feeling that breaking down. So I was just curious, how did you start coping with that while you were trying to do your job? And at what point did it kind of rupture where you felt you couldn't do that anymore?
It was tough in that summer of 2005 when certain things started to become known that, and I had shared it with the press thinking it was true and accurate because that's what they had told me. One of the things, and I will say at that time, when I took the job as press secretary, I figured, okay, it came as a little bit of, I wouldn't say a full surprise, because when I took the position of deputy White House press secretary, that was probably the first time I said, well, maybe someday I will be White House press secretary. I never planned it out that I wanted to do that, but things just kind of happened to work out that way. And then when Ari came to me and called me on the weekend, actually, and said, I'm going to be announcing I'm stepping down about 2.5 years into his time as press secretary. And, within 4 or 5 days or 6 days, I think we'd made a trip to Crawford. The president had offered me the job. We kept it quiet for a little while because once you announce it, then all the attention focuses on you. And it wasn't for 2 months before I took over. Everybody said, when the scandal broke in 2003, and it's kind of the beginnings of a re-elect, everybody was pleased with the way I handled everything and kind of kept it from becoming a big issue. Then when it came out in that summer of 2005, because it was under investigation, because the special prosecutor had asked us not to talk about it, because maybe some in the White House didn't want us to talk about it, I'm in a tough position with the press. I had to rely on the relationships that I had with the press to some extent to get me through that time. I did think about, is this a good time for me to leave? But when I asked myself that question, I said, well, it's not the president who did this to me, in my view, that has misled me. I had a good relationship with him. I'd worked for him for over 7 years altogether, and I had great trust in him. But it was difficult getting through that whole time period, and particularly after Scooter Libby, it became known he was involved, and then he was indicted. I remember that morning when we're sitting in the senior staff meeting in the Roosevelt room of the White House. He sat directly across from me, and Aide walked in with a pink phone slip. And that was when he was being notified that he was going to be indicted. Walked out of that room, and we never saw him again at the White House. Very tough moment, obviously, but and it was particularly tough for me after that. But I mentioned earlier that it was White House reporters during that time when I couldn't really defend myself that were coming to my defense to some extent by literally going on the air and saying, he's in a tough spot. He was misled. He's a straight shooter and someone we trust. And so I appreciated that. That kind of got me through that whole period. But I also recognized that looking back on it, that it was the beginning of the end for me. It was just a matter of time before it was time to leave.
I hate to pick on you, Scott, but I think I'm going to follow that up with just a little bit more pressing on the issue. This may be an unfair question.
Sounds like a briefing.
Exactly. This is maybe an unfair question, but when, as Dr. Mann mentioned, when somebody decides to dissent against war, it's obviously a complicated moral calculus that comes with that. My question, once again, is probably unfair for you, but I want to know, why not do more? What was the limit for you? Do you feel like maybe in hindsight you should have or could have spoken out more firmly against the war in Iraq, done it sooner perhaps, or as you left the administration, spoken more forcibly?
Maybe, but I don't know. It really took me when I left the White House, and when you've been there for almost 5.5 years in the West Wing, in the heart of a lot of very difficult issues. I remember waking up that next morning at 5 o'clock like I usually would, and I said, you know what, I don't have to get up. I'm going to go back to sleep for a little bit. It takes a long time to really decompress from being in the White House for that long. And then it was probably about a year into it. I had a lot of literary agents coming to me, asking me if I was interested in writing a book, and I said, well, maybe, but not right now. And then it was about a year later that I said, well, maybe. I'd be interested in exploring it. And, when you're in the middle of it all, and when you have great trust and respect for the person you're working for, which I still do, as I said, I have a special place for people that are willing to put themselves out there and run for elected office, and particularly the highest office in the land, and what they have to go through and what the family has to go through as well, coming from elected office on the local level where my mother was mayor at a very early age. It was easy for, it was tough when people are saying things about her, but when it was saying things about me, it was easy at that point because I'd grown up around it. But I had to step back and really, and I mentioned this to Bob earlier today. I said, when I was going through that process and meeting with publishers that my literary agent had set up with, one of them had asked me, and I wrote about this in the opening of my book. And I said, I'm going to give an honest look at things. It's not going to be like some of my fellow colleagues who had written books before that. It was very all just pro-Bush, 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 or pro-Bush administration. I said, I don't know where I'm going to end up with this, but I do want to explore how things didn't turn out the way we had hoped. And he looked at me and he said, the toughest part for you is going to be questioning everything that you believed at the time. And so it was a process that I went through. And as I went through that process and started looking back and questioning my own thinking on things, that's when it started to open up for me. And certainly from my personal beliefs, I very much am a person that believes you should not go to war unless it's absolutely necessary. But also, as a spokesman, yes, I had a duty to the public, and I believe that very strongly too, just in my personal nature and who I am, but I was also there speaking for the president and his agenda and trying to help him advance that agenda. So it's hard to kind of separate yourself when you're in the middle of that situation. And you know, the other question was when the publisher I decided to go with, he said, I'm only going to ask you one question: is this going to be an honest look at things? That's all I want to know. I don't need to know anything else. And I said yes. And he checked with reporters at the White House. He checked with reporters in Texas, and he said they all told me, he told you that, you can take him at his word. And so it went through that whole process. And there were times when I didn't sleep at night when I was getting toward the end of writing that book, wondering, can I go through with this? Those are people I knew very well and spent a lot of time with and became friends with on a very personal level, and certainly the President and Mrs. Bush, beyond just working in the White House. So. Yeah, maybe, but I think I had to go through that process. For me personally, it took that process to get me there. And I wanted to have probably started that process if it had not been for that Valerie Plame leak episode situation. When in 2005, I looked at the press and we couldn't talk about it. And I went out there at the podium and I said, well, yeah, this is an investigation. Special prosecutors asked us not to talk. And we didn't talk about it amongst ourselves because we were all being called before the grand jury. I don't know if I made the right decision or not. I was the only one, I think, that didn't have a lawyer at the time. Yeah, that's what everybody says because you never know what's going to happen. But at the same time, I didn't feel like I needed one. And I went before the grand jury just like everybody else, met with the special prosecutor and was interviewed and so forth. But I said, when this investigation is over, I look forward to talking to you about what I knew and what I know about it. And everybody in the White House was kind of like, oh, that was great, good. That's a good way to say to kind of move beyond it a little bit. Of course, when I decided to start that process, the only way I could do it was by taking a look at the larger context of how that happened. Some of my former colleagues didn't like that part of it, but I think there's the good and the bad in the book. I hope people appreciate the kind of person I came to know in President Bush when they read that book too.
We have time for one last question.
The Benghazi incident or tragedy or event continues to kind of bubble up, and I assume is going to have lasting implications for former Ambassador Clinton. And I wondered if you mind doing any Monday morning quarterbacking on that, about how the information was released in terms of, it seemed like a debacle, total debacle to me, and it certainly obviously had political ramifications. We have congressional hearings and so forth. Do you mind commenting, or either of you, as speakers, on what you might have learned?
And Bob should add to this. He probably has some good insights on this as well, and Larry as well. But if you think back to, and I won't recall everything right this second, but when that whole incident happened, there were things that could have been handled better in terms of sharing information with the media and the way it was handled. At the same time, I look at how that is just another example of how things become too politicized in D.C. as well to some extent. And but yeah, it was the information being shared in a timely manner that was accurate and timely. Certainly there are a lot of things that could have been done better there from the administration standpoint, from Secretary of State standpoint, and so forth. But to me, I don't know much about what's new that we don't already know, and I'm probably one of those people that thinks, we need to get beyond all this and focus on larger issues that really matter today. Hopefully we've learned a lot from that incident, and any mistakes that were made are corrected. But I don't like it becoming one of those political footballs, and it'll come back because certainly with her running for election as president, it'll certainly come back in the headlines. But I hope we can get on to more important issues that are occurring now.
I'll just say that, I think one of the tragedies of Benghazi was that there was Susan Rice, who the president wanted to nominate for Secretary of State, lost that job, and I think so. I think she lost it unfairly. I don't think she was complicit in any cover. I think the investigation has proved that she was not, was not lying, was not trying to spread disinformation. I think that Benghazi is a good example of almost any story we see breaking in the news today. We ought to be very skeptical of what we hear about it, what's reported in the first day or two. I don't care if it's the president saying it or someone who is an eyewitness. I think that we shouldn't rush to conclusions that we know all the story. In those kind of incidents, those kinds of episodes, the truth unfolds. We're still learning stuff about the Kennedy assassination, for crying out loud, and so I agree with Scott. I think the Congress. I find it ironic that Congress, I'm going to be a little partisan here, that this Republican Congress has spent more time investigating what happened at Benghazi than they ever did investigating what happened in Iraq. I'd like to see I'd like to see the same vigilance to uncover the truth about Iraq as they've applied to whatever happened in Benghazi. I'm not saying that whatever happened in Benghazi isn't important and doesn't deserve to be known, but after how many investigations, how much more are we going to, learn that's going to be that's going to fundamentally change the story? I don't know.
Well, one quick thing, and perhaps it's one of the rules out there too, is that some of the early things that were being said, probably people were jumping a little bit in front of what was known in the immediate aftermath, and that's a lesson too. I mean, certainly in crisis communications, you want to get out there and share facts as quickly as you can, but you want to make sure what you're saying is accurate. Because the first reports usually turn out to be inaccurate. So.
Very good job.
Thanks.